Hello and welcome to Auspol Explained. I'm your curly-haired host, David. Should Australia become a republic, or should it stay as a constitutional monarchy? What are the pros and cons? Well, to help you figure out what you think the answer is, I've done a two-part interview series where I do a deep dive into that very topic. And this episode is the pro-monarchy interview where I sat down via Zoom with someone from the Australian Monarchist League to ask why, in his view, Australia should maintain its system of constitutional monarchy. Of course, I encourage you to hear from both sides, so I've also done an interview with the co-chair of the Australian Republic movement, where she offers up the competing perspective and counter-arguments. I highly recommend checking out that episode after this one if you haven't already, so you can critically examine and compare the two ideas. Both of these interviews actually offered me new perspective and ideas that I hadn't considered before. So a link to the other interview, as well as the websites for both the Australian Monarchist League and Australian Republic movement, are linked in the description so you can learn more about both movements. But enough talking, enough introductions. Let's dive right into our examination of the monarchist perspective and transition into the interview with today's guest introducing himself and of course giving a brief physical description for accessibility purposes.
Well, hello, David. Thank you very much for having me on your show. My name is Alexander Voltz. I'm three things predominantly, but two are that I'm a composer, first and foremost, and I'm also a monarchist. I believe strongly in the system that we have, and that's why I'm on your show today. Now, a physical description, oh goodness, what would you say? I'm 25. There's nothing particularly striking about me. I'm only 5 foot something or other, 5'12".
Tell us about the Australian Monarchist League.
The Australian Monarchist League, well, that's an organisation that I'm a part of as a national spokesperson and also someone who's very involved up here in Queensland, which is where I'm coming from to you today. The Australian Monarchist League is the chief lobby group, if you like, to retain the system of constitutional monarchy that we have in Australia. It's the biggest organisation. We have I would say, a membership reach of about, when you count up everything, about 55 to 60,000 Australians, which is fantastic. Financial members within that and so on. And we've been around since 1993. So we were active then in the aftermath of the Keating government and also the Republic referendum, where there was, of course, large sentiment for an Australian Republic from some quarters, but thankfully not from all Australians. And since those days, we've continued as a lobby group and organisation, and we've done, I think, a tremendous job.
Your job today is to give us the perspective of a monarchist. I've got a few questions for you, some where you get to tell us just outright what you like about a constitutional monarchy, and a few that sort of bring forward some pro-Republican talking points, and I want to know your perspective and rebuttal on that. So to begin with, simply, could you briefly explain what a constitutional monarchy is and give us an overview of why a constitutional monarchy is a benefit to Australia?
A constitutional monarchy is a very simple idea that has evolved out of about 1,000 years of history, and it's inherently means tested as a result of that. It basically is that ultimate executive authority resides in this little golden vessel called the Crown. And that crown has no political identity of its own, and it sits atop the head of a sovereign. And the sovereign, who is constitutionally limited, assumes the burden of wearing that crown and is also not particularly able to wield the powers of that crown. Now, as I said, this is formed out of a long time. As far as Australia goes, that system has only been a benefit to us. Australia is a young nation, relatively speaking, although compared to the nations of today, we've certainly been around for much longer than many others have. But in that brief amount of time, 200 years or so, as the nation is that we understand it, we have soared to heights of success that you wouldn't necessarily expect from this island continent. And that is certainly a testament to our ultimate system of government, which is now constitutional monarchy. It provides us stability, it provides us international security, it provides us economic protection as well. That's something that is not often discussed. Anything that a republic can do, a constitutional monarchy does better. That's basically the prescription here. I'm not making the claim that monarchy is something that is successful. I don't need to make that claim because history shows it. The trajectory of Australia shows empirically that what we have works well. It also shows that monarchies that become republics and things that begin as republics don't work so well on balance. So I don't need to make the claim that what we have works here. What Republicans need to do is make the claim that what they would come up with would be better than what we have. You know, C.S. Lewis said monarchy can easily be debunked. He said this in 1948. Monarchy can easily be debunked, and it can. I mean, the idea of someone parading around with a crown on their head is a little bit preposterous. It's certainly ceremonial. But he followed that line very quickly with, but watch well the debunkers and mark well the faces. And so it is true that in the heart of every Republican lies a president or a lust for power or a jealousy that they don't have what the crown has. And I think that it's extremely important to understand that from the get-go of our conversation, that I'm not necessarily here to make the claim that monarchy works so well, but I am here expecting for Republicans to show me what they could do better.
Well, that is a strong opener. I would say that you're making the claim that a constitutional monarchy, anything a republic can do, it can do better. Let's give you some questions. But before we do, just so people are aware, right? I feel like because we live in a constitutional monarchy, people are sort of generally passively familiar at the very least. Like, oh, this is what this is. Whereas a republic, well, lots of people are like, I'm not entirely sure what that would mean because we don't live in a republic. So to briefly outline what we're comparing and contrasting with, right? A republic is basically a system where the head of state is elected or appointed. How that is done, it just varies based off the model. There are tons of different republics. The USA, for example, though Australia has never proposed to ever be anything like the USA, more likely more like Ireland as a republic. France is a republic where they have a prime minister and a president that sort of share executive power. There's all sorts of different ways, but basically a republic is where a head of state is appointed or elected and is transitory, whereas with a constitutional monarchy like we have today, the monarch basically just maintains being the monarch until they die, or in very, very rare cases, abdicate, and then automatically the heir assumes the throne. There is an element of continuity there. On the Australian Monarchist website, you actually mentioned 4 key points: stability, sovereignty, tradition, and continuity. My question is, why does a monarchy embody those 4 key points in a way that a republic doesn't, or doesn't do as well from your perspective?
If you were to give me a political metric or some sort of national metric by which you could measure or critique success, what would something like that be? The economy, for instance, or political statesmanship and political integrity, or our culture. That's not one that we talk about a lot at all, but the aesthetic of the monarchy is exceptionally important, at least by my metric. And I do have, I would say, some credibility in that area, given that I'm a practicing artist as my profession. In terms of the 4 pillars, sovereignty, well, let's talk about sovereignty. If sovereignty is vested in a president who can be replaced every 4 years or so, then that's not necessarily stable, is it? At least with the crown, you know what you're getting. So you don't want a sovereignty that's divisive, I would say. You want a sovereignty that is obvious, which has the capacity to weather storms that conflict with the nation, whether those are cultural, whether those are geopolitical, or so on. I don't know if Emmanuel Macron has that quality. I don't think Vladimir Putin has that quality. I don't think Xi Jinping has that quality. You don't also want a sovereignty that can be subject to political machinations. So that's sovereignty. Let's leave behind sovereignty. Stability, well, it's true that constitutional monarchy provides stability. You can see that economically. This is an excellent metric to measure stability of our system of government on. Professor Mario Guillen, if that's how one pronounces his name, I'm sorry if it's not, in 2018 conducted a lengthy study into the economies of world nations since 1900. And his hypothesis was that the economies of republics would, on the whole, outperform the economies of monarchies. But he was completely wrong. He was completely wrong for a couple of very simple reasons, but one of which is that the internal politics and stability of a nation is much better served under a crown or a monarchy, constitutional monarchy, that is. It's not the case for an absolute monarchy. There's a few simple reasons for that, but property rights are better protected from assets to taxation. There's less civil insurrection as well, which of course aids the economy. So stability, that's the case. And as I talked about before, the trajectory of Australia, obviously we must be doing something right, and we must be doing it on a foundation that works. If we have achieved so much with a relatively small population over a relatively small period of time. Continuity, I think there's everything to suggest that that trajectory will continue if we maintain our system of constitutional arrangements. And tradition, well, this goes to the cultural and aesthetic value, I suppose, that we were talking about before. The monarchy serves these elements by basically being, if you like, a mausoleum for the very best ideas of the past. That's a good way to describe it. And aesthetically, it embodies the very best ideas of the past that have proved an inspiration throughout time. Those are really what the very best of traditions are, as far as I would describe them. So that's what I would say on the four pillars that the monarchy does.
You mentioned sort of like economics and stability under a constitutional monarchy, but a constitutional monarchy requires the monarch to not really influence and exercise political power. It is up to elected representatives to do that. So what really is the link between a constitutional monarchy and a political stability or economic stability and growth if the monarch has no actual say, power, or influence in that?
It's not that the monarchy requires sovereigns to do anything. What it is that the monarchy prevents politicians from doing what they do best, which is passing legislation and enacting their own fantasies. That's very much the case, what the monarchy does. Well, if you open Pandora's box, let's put it that way, if you take away the crown as this protector of ultimate executive authority, and give it to politicians, which is exactly what will happen if you go down the route of putting a president up in this country. It's not an unreasonable claim or maybe forecast to predict that they will exploit that. And they will exploit that in ways that, well, I don't know. I don't want to speak too ill of politicians. I'm a member of a political party, but I would say, actually, having been a member of a political party for a few years now, if mechanisms exist for people to achieve political expediency, they will do it. They will use those mechanisms to bolster their careers, to increase their power, to silence their political opponents. And within internal parties, this happens. Within broader politicking in Australia, this happens. So it's not at all an unreasonable suggestion that if you give a new mechanism to the political class, that they will use it. And it's from that suggestion, it's not unreasonable to say that there will be division as a result of whatever the political class decides to do with that new power, and then standards of living as a result from that division will decrease.
Well, that's making an assumption on the model of the Republic. The 1999 Republic referendum basically removed political power from the Prime Minister, who can currently just appoint the Governor-General and is the only one who can do that. But circling back, you said that monarchy prevents politicians from doing things, but again, the point of a constitutional monarchy is that the monarch doesn't interfere. Like, it's been a long-standing constitutional convention that the Governor-General just gives royal assent to a bill, and they're doing it on behalf of the monarch, who has no oversight, no personal oversight really, of what happens in our parliament. Some people could argue the 1975 constitutional crisis was an interference from the Crown. Some could argue that it wasn't, and the Queen had no actual personal knowledge of what was happening. It was all John Kerr. But I mean, either way, even if we remove that example, could you give me a tangible way as to how a constitutional monarchy prevents politicians using their political power for personal gain?
If you alter the Constitution as fundamentally by removing the heart of the Constitution, which is the Crown, fundamentally, everything within the Constitution derives from the Crown, then you will give a green light to subsequent changes. This is one problem that the Republicans have got. If they propose such a sweeping change, the idea that that change would be finite and wouldn't lead to successive changes is flawed, I think. And I think that history shows that almost perfectly. The best example would be France. France is an excellent case study for anyone who's interested in what happens when you alter your constitution to the point that you just, I think they had 30 constitution or 14 constitutions in the time that we've had one, or since we were settled. The French didn't have a very good monarchy. They had an absolute monarchy. It then became a republic in a really violent manner, and not a manner that anyone wants to emulate. And from that republic grew totalitarian empire. And that has happened consistently throughout history. It doesn't matter if you take the French, it doesn't matter if you take the Germans in the 20th century or the Russians. It doesn't matter if you go as far back as the Romans when they went from monarchy to republic to empire. The inevitable result when you destroy the stability of your constitution, which the French did to an irredeemable extent, you inevitably lead to the rules of the game, if you like, the rules of the nation state being so politically collapsed that anyone can swoop in and assert power if they are the strongest demagogue in the room. It's what happened in the case of Napoleon. It's what happened in the case of Stalin. It's seeming to be what's happening in the case of Xi Jinping, and it's already happened in the case of Vladimir Putin. Republics break down the stability that constitutions give them and that constitutional monarchies give them, and they create a gateway for people to come in. History shows this conclusively. Oh, and the idea that people would say, oh, but those are other countries, that wouldn't happen in Australia. That's not true. That's a very, I would say, naive perspective to hold. So I think based off all of that, when you ask me, how is it the case that constitutional monarchies limit politicians from having more power, you only need to look at history.
The other point I wanted to bring up is democracy. Now, a constitutional monarchy is a democratic system. There's no doubt about that. There are obviously lots of negative examples of republics. There are nearly 200 countries. But if we look at the Economist Democracy Index, the top 10 countries, 5 of them are constitutional monarchies and 5 of them are republics. And if you expand it further, you still get about a 50-50 spread when we get to the most democratic countries in the world with the most free elections and freedom of press, etc., etc. Australia, by the way, is not in the top 10. Given that, like, some republics are very much stable and very much democratic, my question really to you is, when we talk back about the sovereignty and continuity of a monarchy, why is it a better idea as opposed to having a little bit more of a democratic element where people have input in replacing the head of state? Does that not rob a level of accountability if we cannot remove the monarch and sovereign except via death, which we should not do? We should have no personal agency in that. Or they're just, made unwell and can't do the job.
The idea that the Crown has no democratic legitimacy or isn't subject to democratic feeling is false. The Crown can be removed by the referendum process, which is about as democratic as you can get.
I mean, as like an individual, if we were like, we don't like King Charles, well, we just wait until King Charles dies. Not removing the concept of monarchy. Like, if we like the monarchy, but we don't like the monarch, what do we do?
Well, the monarch is subordinate to the Crown. That's the other extremely important thing. The monarch is simply the person who's unfortunately selected to wear the crown. It is not the case that the sovereign has, I would say, a good job. I don't think the sovereign has a job that any sane person would reasonably want. And I think you're seeing that now, in the sense that both the King and the Princess of Wales have cancer, and yet they're still being required to perform public duties and serve their country. Now, no individual would be expected to do that. In that way, the Crown is very Christ-like. It's all about service and suffering, and that's why it's fitting for the monarch to retain association with the Christian faith, I believe. I think you mentioned the top or the top 10 democratic indexes or so on, or historically that index has disproportionately had constitutional monarchies in its top rankings. And remember, there will always be a little bit of fluctuation year from year because certain domestic policies change, but overall, constitutional monarchies are well represented in the upper echelons of that index. I think in 2022, I think the only republic to be in there was Finland. Now, no, or Iceland. I think it was Iceland. Iceland has the population of Brisbane and runs its elections like Brisbane runs its election for Lord Mayor. The idea necessarily that the priorities of Iceland are the priorities of Australia is probably not a really true dichotomy. Whilst I've been referring to history a lot in my responses, I've been referring to archetypal human concepts of power and greed and jealousy. I haven't necessarily been making the case that we would do what France has done at a domestic policy level. And I think that's important to separate out. So when you see that these monarchies or republics are performing from year to year at different rankings on that Economist Democracy Index, it is because that they have unique things about their nation. You know, the idea that dynastic power is not inherent to republics is simply false. I mean, look at Hillary Clinton, who ran for the Democrats after her husband was the president, or look at George Bush Jr., or look at many Australian politicians today whose fathers were in Parliament, Bob Catter. And this doesn't just occur at a federal level, it occurs at a state level as well. Republicans often say, oh, well, I think that we should get rid of the sovereign because dynastic power is ridiculous. Dynastic power is in everything that we do, whether it's from our politics as they currently are, to our inheritance laws on wealth, to the sixth generation Australian farmer whose family has been supplying the nation with food for years. I find these shallow arguments that the Republicans make. I just question fundamentally those things. But I would say that year by year, that index fluctuates, but on the whole, constitutional monarchies are disproportionately represented in its best rankings. Yeah.
The Australian Republic movement argues that Australia should have an Australian as a head of state, and they should be chosen based off merit, not by birth. Whereas in a constitutional monarchy, the head of state is a hereditary position. You get it by being the firstborn. I mean, you already just talked about the dynastic element, but do you have anything else to add about why you believe having a hereditary system versus a elected or appointed system is a better version?
Why do I not mind a hereditary system? Because I'm not a jealous person. I don't mind that a son has inherited from his mother a very, very undesirable job. Really, we should actually be grateful that no one else has to assume these burdens, which last for life, which the monarch didn't choose, you know. But the more significant and preposterous inference that Republicans make is that the president would be selected on merit. I mean, this is ridiculous assumption and suggestion. Do you really believe that the Australian Parliament is filled with people who were elected on merit? I mean, that's outrageous. It's not the case at all. I've been to plenty of pre-selections in my time internally within political parties. I can assure you, not always the most meritorious candidate wins. The idea that that human element wouldn't come to the fore in a presidential debate, which if the president is directly elected by the Australian people, only the most wealthy and celebrity and political candidates will be represented. That will probably be the case if the president is elected via parliamentary intervention, which is what was argued for in 99. At the same time, I mean, jobs for the boys are going at good rates these days. And the idea that the president wouldn't be any different, it's just ludicrous to me. No, that is a false thing to say. It's got nothing to do with merit. And it's one of these straw mans that Republicans completely throw up in the air all the time. Would be elected on merit. Well, would they? You know, who are going to be the candidates to begin with? You know, and how are they going to be chosen? And how are they going to file for their application? You know, don't tell me that there's something wrong with the Crown. Give me a concrete model of what you would do. Look, the Australian Republic movement in 2021 released its Australian Choice model. And that's not even to touch on the fact that there are multiple Republican movements in Australia. Real Republic would be another one. The Republicans are completely divided, and a house that's divided can't stand. So I don't understand why it is that we should be entertaining their ludicrous assertions that somehow the king is not a meritorious candidate, or at least an unfortunate and unfortunate in the sense that he's burdened candidate to hold the role that he holds.
So the Australian Republic movement, as you just mentioned, has a proposed model. There are other Republic movements as well. There is no current model for the government that they are examining or putting forward, so we can't really dissect that. That's really a thing for the future. The last time we had a Republic referendum was 25 years ago in 1999. We're not going to go into that particular model, but since 1999, quite a few countries around the world have become republics. There are more and more republics around the world. In fact, Queen Elizabeth II, she was the sovereign of 32 independent nations, and when King Charles III ascended to the throne, he became the sovereign of 15. Just before he became king, Barbados had left and become a republic in 2021. Polls show that support for a monarchy is higher with older generations, the kind of people that are more likely to have a stronger influence of British cultural ties to the sort of younger generations. And certainly my analytics show that anytime the monarchy is mentioned, that 55 plus crowd comes to view that video, whereas my regular videos, that 55 plus crowd is just non-existent. Does it seem like becoming a republic is a somewhat inevitable process? Is it not just another evolution in sort of modern nationhood and political systems?
I don't think it's inevitable that we will become a republic, so long as people like you and I are prepared to have these conversations in public. What's not been done for a significant amount of time in our history is to actually talk about this in the open. And I think the more you talk about it in the open, the more that reason and truth will prevail. And that is that all the facts show that what we have is not something to lose. You talk about nations leaving the Commonwealth. How well is Barbados going at the moment? Or how well is South Africa going? Or Zimbabwe? Or how was it when India left and 100,000 or so of Gandhi's political opponents were imprisoned? It's all one thing to say X amount have left, will be the next one. It's another thing to actually stop and see how they went once they left. On the face of it, the most successful countries in the Commonwealth, I think I am right to say this, would remain Canada, New Zealand, and Australia.
Those are the larger ones.
But as a similarity as well, they've also retained their structures. And in New Zealand, monarchy is far more implemented. In Canada, monarchy is far more implemented than it is here. So where I agree with you is where I might agree with you is if there was a country to go first, it would probably have the best chance being in Australia. You know, how well is it working out for countries that leave? I don't think it's demonstrably clear that they're better off than when they were a realm within the Commonwealth.
We can't really say much about Barbados because it's not a very long-term study, and also 2021, very much COVID times, so I don't think anyone's doing particularly well. But in terms of what Barbados did, is they very much preserved a lot of the sort of structures and institutions and the parliamentary system just went president instead of governor general. Anyway, let's talk about tradition. There's this idea that monarchy is very steeped in tradition. At the very start of this, you mentioned it has a history going back almost 1,000 years, with like the English monarchy that eventually evolved into the British monarchy and now the Australian monarchy. Tradition is undeniably important, but I also want to point out there are lots of traditions. There are traditions that are 60,000 years old, still practiced in Australia. There are traditions from all across the world that have been brought here as part of our multicultural society that has very much changed from the very dominant British settler ideas and culture, 200 years ago to a more of a melting pot that it is now. Why is it that this particular tradition is, in your view, the ideal one? Why is one that has British roots and British ties an important tradition that we must maintain instead of, creating new traditions that reflect different cultural ties and backgrounds of a more diverse nation that we are now?
There's a couple of ways you can go about answering this. The first thing to say is that our existing institutions that we've grown up with in terms of the law, but in terms of even very simple things like street names and place names, these are largely tied into the Crown. English common law is our law, which itself, English common law, I would say fundamentally is underpinned by the Ten Commandments. And so therefore it actually seems to be completely logical for the king to be a defender of the Christian faith, which still legally regulates the morality of our society, basically. It's not the case, for example, that Australian law is principally informed by Sharia law, is it? So more broadly, is the idea of multiculturalism and traditions and things. You must have a dominant tradition in any society. You must. That's not to say you can't have a plural of cultures. You certainly can. But you must have a dominant tradition or a narrative or an idea so that the nation knows what it is. This philosophy is incredibly important, and you can see what happens when you lose it. You can go back and look at the French. The French, once they tear out the crown, once they change everything about their society for a brief period of time, and then they do it again, and then they do it again, and then they do it again. And on average, it's 30. I think I'm really right in saying this. You're welcome to fact check it, but I think it's 14 constitutions in the time since James Cook arrived in Botany Bay. And if you look what occurred during the Reign of Terror, one of the first things that changed was the revolutionaries. They basically fell out of communion with Rome. So France was a Catholic country. They fell out of communion with Rome. By the time of Robespierre, which is only about 5 years, 1794, I think, is when the cult of the supreme being arises in France, which is basically this pagan Mother Earth cult. It's only 5 years into the experiment. By this time, the French people are just confused. They don't. Everything keeps changing. There's no dominant stability and tradition there for them to affix themselves to so that they know how to traverse the difficulties of the future. Having a dominant tradition in society, and I believe that the Crown provides this tradition, is exceptionally important. The other thing as well is that I mentioned right from the get-go, the Crown doesn't have a political identity. So let's separate that from what is a tradition, which is the idea that ultimate executive authority should be regulated to ennoble society and propel it towards a future that is not as tarnished by human weakness. Let's put it that way. Let's separate that from the Crown's capacity to represent people of different backgrounds. Because the Crown itself doesn't have a policy position on anything, other than maybe its own survival, but that would be probably a semantic point. It has that capacity, if people so choose, to be represented by it. The same can't be said of politicians and indeed presidents. Presidents have mandates. Politicians have mandates. The Crown transcends that. It is above politics. And in so transcending the muck, if you like, it's able to be there for everyone.
I did actually write down in my notes a direct quote from the website, the Australian Monarchist website about sovereignty. I think you've summarised it very well, actually. The quote is, "By declaring an oath of loyalty to the monarch, one declares it through him or her to the people. One cannot reasonably declare an oath to the Australian people, as the term has no sense. There is no unified Australian people. It is a mass of disparate individuals, but the monarch as sovereign represents all these different peoples in a secure guardianship and provides the absolute authority needed to ensure the continuity of governance."
As we talked about earlier, that is all true, but at the same time, that is not divorced from the idea that the Crown is democratically illegitimate. The Crown is not out of touch with democratic sentiment. If the Crown was out of touch with democratic sentiment, assent would be denied to bills that pass in Parliament, for instance, but that's never been done. But more to the point, the Crown remains bound by the referendum protocols, which the Australian people through the Parliament can implement if they so desire. If that's the direction that democratic sentiment goes in, that can be done. But this is an interesting thing because I'd like to bring this up if it's okay. I watched a previous video that you did on the cost of the royal tour that's about to occur. And I thought it was an excellent video, by the way. I don't have a problem with the video at all, but I did want to respond to a point that was raised by the Australian Republic movement. Now, I think in that video you said it's since 2011, royal visits have cost $6 million.
Approximately.
Let's work with 6 million because that's what I've factored my calculations around. So that's over about a 13-year period. Okay. And the Republicans say to us, oh, well, we shouldn't be paying this wanton extravagance. It's so expensive, waste of taxpayer money. The previous referendum, which we just had, cost $364 million. Assuming the referendum expense doesn't increase, which it will inevitably because that's what's happened for every referendum conducted in Australia. Price always goes up with population. You could pay, let's say, $364 million to ask the question as to whether we should become a republic, or you could fund royal visits for the next 788 years. Now, this is an interesting question. I find the whole cost angle of the monarchy to be a very disingenuous one that the Republicans put up. On average, 110 million euros are spent every year on running the president's obligations to the French Republic. You know, the Obama White House, I think I read somewhere, per annum was costing about 1.2 billion US dollars every year. The idea that a republic would be cheaper than our current arrangements is completely preposterous. And, every ship in the Australian Navy would need to be renamed. Defence would have to completely overhaul how it goes about its charters, its obligations, its aesthetic, because the crown would be removed. Our coat of arms would have to be redone. If the crown goes, there will be other changes. The flag will change. There's no way, if you adhere to the Peter Fitzsimons mantra of we must throw off all our colonial vestiges, that the flag can remain. This is the problem that the French have had throughout history. Once they make the change, they need to convince people that the change they made was a good idea in the first place. That requires, David, a complete and utter redesign of society. But the paradox in so doing that is when you completely redesign everything around everyone in such a short space of time, they lose their understanding of what their nation is. And they lose their understanding of why their nation is important. It's not what they know. It's something different. It's not theirs anymore. And you can look at the decline of, I have a thesis here, you can look at the decline of French military success over the course of the 19th and 20th century. And you can definitely, I think, put a thesis that morale was much lower in that country, and no one really knew what they were fighting for in the end. And in our increasingly difficult geopolitical times, particularly in the Asia-Pacific theatre, I don't think it's a good idea to start radically changing what everyone's understanding of their nation is. And we're already seeing it, David, and it's already proving to be exceptionally divisive. The Australian Broadcasting Corporation's renaming or at least re-identification of common capital city names and town names with Indigenous language, for instance, is proving to be a divisive thing. It's certainly altering people's understanding of what they thought their nation was. I just don't know if you do that, whether ultimately that proves beneficial or not.
You talked a lot about the dangers of change just then. I'd like to point out that the monarchy changes, Australian identity changes. We didn't always have the Australian flag. The current one that we have now, different amount of points on the stars. There's the original one. Originally had Victoria's coat of arms in a bunch of parliaments because we hadn't created the kangaroo and emu coat of arms. Western Australia's coat of arms didn't exist, wasn't officially proclaimed until like 1969. On top of that, there was no Australian monarchy as a separate entity until the exact date people can argue about. Some say it's like 1926 when governors general no longer represented the UK but represented Australia on behalf of the monarch, or the Statute of Westminster in the 30s and 40s. There was no Australian monarchy. There was the British monarchy. We were all British subjects, and then there became these sort of separate elements of, King Charles, or, whoever the sovereign is at the time, acts as the sovereign of this nation on the advice of ministers of that nation as a sort of separate metaphorical hat from there and there and there, as opposed to the king of all the dominions. So, in terms of change, even background things like symbols, branding, our money is different all the time. There is a cost associated with updating the face on the back of a coin. We used to have paper money, now we have polyester money. There is just a general ongoing cost and upkeep to having a nation. But the monarchy itself has changed, I would say a lot over the past 100 years. The way we relate to it has changed. Change is inevitable. So is a republic really that scary if change just is an inevitable element? We can choose to change our monarchy, or we could choose to change our republic. Is there really that much of a problem? Because ultimately we do have democratic input and choice on how we shape either of these institutions going forward, because neither of them will be static.
Change does occur, that's true. Change for the better, as you highlighted, is not a guarantee, and it's not a guarantee that a republic could bring about a change for the better. Whilst there have been great changes of the magnitude that you outlined just then in our nation, since federation, there have been three underlying principles that have, if you like, created a sandbox for Australia to play within. That this is the case. And those three principles are set out in the preamble of the Constitution. And that's why any change to the preamble of the Constitution should be opposed. It doesn't matter what it is, because the entirety of the Constitution is understood through the preamble. And the preamble highlights three things. It says, we the states, XXXX, excluding Western Australia.
We're in there somewhere.
Yes, you are. You are in there somewhere. with the Kiwis. 1, humbly relying upon the blessing of Almighty God. Okay, first principle. Important because it basically sets up the blessing of Almighty God is the 10 Commandments, is the legal code, is the morality of our nation. Okay, that's crucial. 2, agree to unite in one indissoluble union. Okay, so now what we have is a unified continent working for a federal good, competitively, but working for a federal good. You don't have the selfishness of states, although you dangerously saw this during COVID, running off and doing their own thing. So that has been a factor. There's been a unification of purpose, that this continent, this island nation, is united in what it is trying to achieve. Number 3, and critically, agree to unite under the Crown of Great Britain. So not necessarily under the royal family or under King Charles or Queen Elizabeth or even Queen Victoria, under the Crown. And it's for me those words that clearly show that what we're about here for constitutional monarchy transcends personalities. But also it shows that the developments that our nation has managed have occurred within these three fundamental guiding principles, one of which, and probably the most significant if you're not religious, is the maintenance that there is an ultimate umpire who wields executive authority through not wielding executive authority, so that others cannot usurp that authority and use it for their own ends, which would perhaps be contrary to the unified, indissoluble federation and to the blessing of Almighty God. I mean, this is exceptionally profound stuff. You won't find anything of the order of literary magnitude, if you like, in the US Constitution. Humbly relying on the blessing of Almighty God under the crown, indissoluble union. That's very powerful and binding stuff, and I would say that it's definitely been a subconscious inspiration. And subconscious is important because the Constitution works so well, David, that no one really knows about it. And they don't need to know about it. Politics is not shoved in the faces of ordinary Australians like it is in the US. You don't have people running around asserting their constitutional right and therefore sowing division in society. You actually have a far more homogenous population that recognizes that what we have works so well that it's not even that we're politically apathetic, because that's not been the case in recent years. The Australian people, I don't think, are that politically apathetic on the face of it. But they do recognise that what we have works. It's not to be tampered with. And it works so well. I don't need to dedicate years of my formative life studying it. And that's something not to be taken for granted. That's a very special thing indeed.
My final point is to really bring up the religious aspect of the monarchy. For those who don't know, the motto of the monarch is God and my right. It's in French. I will not butcher the pronunciation of French. It's in reference to the divine right of kings to rule. The coronation of the sovereign is a religious ceremony done in an abbey, in a church. The monarch is inherently the supreme governor of the Church of England. How do we separate, how do we reconcile the idea of a secular country or secular government with a sovereign that is inherently a religious figure, and not just a broad religious figure, a specific denomination? Catholics are simply not allowed to inherit the throne and have not been allowed to inherit the throne for over 300 years before the British ever even set their eyes on Australia. So, how can we reconcile such an inherently religious figure with a country full of different religious faiths, or a parliament and government that may or may not have any religious leanings, whether it is Church of England or otherwise?
The king's obligations his religious obligations don't descend into the political fray to begin with. So there's no theocratic autocracy being imposed on Australia or anywhere in the Commonwealth. In actual fact, you've seen the sovereign use his prerogative to have a multi-faith coronation, in a sense. So that reflects his private leanings there. We talked earlier about the importance of tradition and having a dominant tradition. And I think my answer is fairly similar to what we discussed then. It's certainly the case that when immigrants come to Australia, they bring with them their traditions. And so far, domestic policy hasn't required them to give their traditions up. So I just wonder, with the flourishing of, shall we say peripheral, because they have to be peripheral, because there has to be a dominant hierarchy, a theme, and there has to be that for the nation to succeed. So these peripheral beliefs, no one's asking for those people who hold those beliefs or traditions to give them up. They're in Australia for a reason and making it a plural of cultures. I wonder why they would try and change something about our nation, which, as I say throughout this conversation, history suggests hasn't impeded our development at all. As we talked about, the Church of England, the King's Anglican Communion, if you like, is in accordance with the guiding principles of English common law. It certainly marries to an even greater extent, the three principles we just outlined in the preamble. The crown which we are under also happens to rely upon the blessing of Almighty God. I mean, this is a consistency that shouldn't be taken for granted. What we have is not inevitable. It's not inevitable that this is the status quo. It's the case that through getting things right and through getting things wrong in the past and through learning from those mistakes, we have arrived at the point that we are at. And I think that there will be people who shout from the rooftops for change when A, they don't really know what the change is they want. They just think change is a good thing. And B, more often than not, their change is not a good thing at all. And it's a conservative attitude, but don't take this for granted. That's the one thing I would say to your listeners in conclusion.
Well, thank you very much for your time. Quite a decent amount of it. I want to thank you genuinely very, very much for your perspective and what you've added to this conversation. I've learned a few things myself, I would say.
Well, thank you so much. And congratulations to you as well on all the good work that you do in providing a more public discourse on our system of government. I do think that that's fantastic. And as I alluded to earlier in the conversation, that's what we need to have more of. So congratulations.
Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you so much, David. You too.
And there you have it. Thank you very much to Alexander for his perspective and time. Again, if you haven't checked out the interview I did with Esther from the Australian Republic movement, please do it now. Right now, to compare and contrast, or later if you don't have the time right now. Also, the websites of both the Australian Monarchist League and Australian Republic movement are linked below in the description so you can learn more about the respective organisations and hey, maybe even get involved with one of the movements if it takes your interest. Comment down below the thing you found most interesting about this interview. Please be respectful in the comments and don't forget to like, share and subscribe. All those algorithmic stuff to help support me. And speaking of supporting me, thank you so much to my supporters on Patreon who give me emotional support as well as money to motivate me to continue doing hours of editing. Thank you so much, genuinely. I'll see you next time.